We'll just thank you. We'll let a few more log in here and then we'll get started. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Servos. I'm the Director of Commercialization Education at Fast Forward Medical Innovation, also known as FFMI. And I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which is the 6th and final webinar that we have been planning with the Department of Internal Medicine here at the University of Michigan. Before I introduce our speakers and we get started, I just have a few technical items that I'd like to cover. If you have a question today, which I hope you do, please type it into the Q&A feature within Zoom. Our staff will be monitoring the Q&A feature as well as the chat function to answer any questions that you have, as well as link to any resources that are discussed today by our speakers. I'll note also that after the presentation today, we'll be sending a recording along with a PDF version of the slide deck and an opportunity for you to take an evaluation so that we can improve upon our programming the next time we offer it. Today's webinar is titled Next Steps and Commercialization Resources, where we will discuss two very specific funding mechanisms, the MTRAC program within the University of Michigan's Innovation Partnerships Group here on campus, as well as the Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund held within FFMI and the Center for Entrepreneurship at the College of Engineering. Today, you're going to hear from three speakers. You'll first hear from Brad Martin, who is the director of FFMI at the University of Michigan Medical School's Office of Research. You'll then hear from Meghan Cuddihy, who is the director of the MTRAC program within Innovation Partnerships. And then John Seamans, the fund manager for the Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund, will close our discussion today. So I want to thank you all three for being here. And Brad, I will turn things over to you.
Okay, let me just share my screen here. Can you all see that?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, you won't hear from me for very long today, but thanks, John. But I just want to do a little bit of level setting on the process for commercializing research out of the university before I turn it over to Meghan and John to talk about funding of some of these translational research activities or startup companies. There's an incredible number of resources at the University of Michigan that are devoted to translational research and commercialization, and understanding that pathway can be a little bit complex. We understand that. And so what I want to do is just at a very high level, just talk a little bit about the process for taking your research ideas that you really think have commercial value and moving them forward. And what's the process for doing that at the University of Michigan? So this is just a schematic that shows a little bit about the process for moving from basic research to a product in the marketplace. Most of you are probably at this basic science or basic research stage, perhaps getting the translational research stage. When research really becomes product development, that really refers to the process of translational research, taking a good research idea and figuring out if it has commercial potential or not. If it does, the common pathway, the common pinch point for all technologies at the University of Michigan is the Innovation Partnerships Group, which serves as technology transfer function here. I want to remind people that work that's conducted at the University of Michigan in laboratories at the University of Michigan, no matter whether it's funded through an NIH grant or through your own startup dollars, the intellectual property is owned by the university, not the researchers. And it's their job to license it out. They're going to help you license it out, and they're going to ask for your involvement, perhaps, but it really is up to the tech transfer office. I'm sorry, I always have to catch myself. I still call it the tech transfer office, but their new name is Innovation Partnerships, but I'll use the terms almost interchangeably. But it's their job to then license it out to the outside the university, either in the form of a license to an existing company or perhaps to a startup company that you are involved with. And they will work with you to figure out the best path for moving it forward, whether it be a startup or a license to an existing company. And it's their job to license that and market that product to the public. The university does not directly sell or market anything other than our technology. We license it out to existing companies and startup companies who then take it on into the marketplace. And so the idea, when is something right for commercialization? When do you know if something that you are working on has commercial value? So typically the process of going from idea to a commercial potential, commercial product is shown on this timeline, if you will, here. Usually the process involves you have an idea, you submit this idea to the NIH or some other extramural granting agency to fund the research. Oftentimes then the goal of that research is a publication. And typically what happens is that in the process of publicizing this, in the process of getting a publication out, speaking at national meetings, oftentimes what will happen is that when you're at the meeting, someone will approach you and say, they're from a company or an investment company, an investment group, and they really are anxious to work with you or to license the technology. That may be the first indication that the outside world is anxious to receive your technology. Once you realize that that is the case, that what I'm working on does have some potential, the first step is to talk to the Innovation Partnerships Group and protect that intellectual property. Again, the intellectual property filing is a key part of this. The university owns it, but they are dependent upon you to bring these ideas to them when you think they have commercial potential. And again, it's then that step here between intellectual property and commercialization is the licensing piece that leads to the commercialization. Hang on a second here. My slides don't want to advance. There we go. Now, in terms of resources that are available to help you through this process, again, we're talking about the point here at which you realize you may have something that's of value and you want to think about commercialization. There are a number of resources on campus that can help you move it forward. Our office is in the medical school. We are Fast Forward Medical Innovation, but also, as I mentioned, Innovation Partnerships is responsible for the transactional piece of developing this license that could be has value to the outside world. There's other groups on campus. Michigan Drug Discovery is in the LSI function. The College of Engineering is the Center for Entrepreneurship. And really, most of these resources fall into three major categories. And again, I've sort of listed them here in terms of the order that you'll typically access them. And that's commercialization, education, funding and mentorship, and then business development. I'll talk a little bit more about each of these individually here in the next couple of slides. Typically, commercialization education is the first step that people undertake if they're thinking about this commercialization process. And there are, again, programs all across campus to help you think about the value of your idea, who the customer may be, and what the value proposition to that customer could possibly be. Programs much like this that are departmental programs. We roll them out to internal medicine, Department of Surgery. We're working on a program with the Cancer Center now. That's usually the first step that people that have ideas that they think have value, how they begin to dip their toe in the water. We have a much more formalized program at Fast Forward called Fast Pace, which has been our kind of our cornerstone program in commercialization education. It's a 5-week program that's really focused on customer discovery, determining through customer discovery and talking to people if this idea that I think has so much value really does. Talking to the customers and various people in the ecosystem and understanding what's the value that I provide to those individuals. We also have programs at the Aikens Academy for Aikens Innovation Academy at the Cancer Center. The Cardiovascular Center, and the College of Engineering and the Center for Entrepreneurship is the home for the NSF I-Corps Great Lakes Regional Hub, which is, again, is a very formalized program, again, that's focused on customer discovery. But through any one of these programs, and I would say that they're very similar in design. They each have unique aspects to them, depending upon what area you're working on. But any one of these programs will help you understand, does this idea that I'm working on have value to the outside world? And what is my place in the marketplace? If you determine after taking one of these courses that, yes, indeed, this does have value, the next step is then to do some of the de-risking activities that are really required to take an academic asset and bring it forward. Typically, the amount of work that you would have done under NIH grants to get a publication or to speak at a national meeting, that's good basic science. But oftentimes the private sector wants to see a little bit more de-risking done before they want to make an investment. If you're working on a drug, they may want to see some very early safety toxicology work, some PK/PD. If it's a device, you may want to develop a prototype. NIH is not going to pay for that. So how do you get that work done? Well, there's a number of groups here on campus that fund exactly that kind of work. The first that I'll mention here is the Kickstart and the MTRAC program. You're going to hear from Meghan Cuddihy here in a few moments. She runs those programs. These are dollars from the state of Michigan, the MEDC, with the goal of really stimulating economic development here in the state, new companies, job creation, taking these ideas that are really birthed at the university and giving them some real strong foundations to form a company here in the state of Michigan. There's other programs on campus. The Franklin Innovation Initiative out of the engineering school is the Coulter Translational Research Partnership. This one is really focused on the medical devices. And in addition to that, a number of programs and departments. I think at last count, there were over 40 individual departmental funds that are geared towards developing your research projects. So there's a variety of funding resources available. We can help you pick out the right ones and point in the right direction. Now, if you undertake these activities and the idea still looks like it has potential, there's been no change in the data, no adverse signals that have been encountered, and you think that this really does have potential to move forward, the next step is then to move forward into the licensing and commercialization stage. And again, there's a number of resources here that I want to point out to you. I'll just mention this dotted line here. There comes a point at which the technology is actually licensed outside the university. And that really represents a major transition point. There's a number of resources that you can be brought to bear on a project once it's in the university. Once it's licensed out, it's primarily the domain of the private sector, angel investors, venture capitalists, to some degree, the Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund, which I've got on both sides of this line. They kind of dabble on both sides. And this is a new seed fund that has been set up. Oh, I shouldn't say new. I guess it's probably 5 or 6 years old now, but you'll hear from John Seamans in a few moments, and he runs this program. And this is a small seed fund stage capital to get startup companies that are based on Michigan IP off to a strong start. Provide them with some early stage seed funding to help achieve and move on to maybe some outside investment from angel and VC investors. And this group can also help you make connections with the outside world. We've got a business development group at Fast Forward that can help make contacts with industry. And then again, innovation partnerships is a key component here. They are the group that operates on both sides of this transitional line. They help you form the intellectual property, secure the intellectual property, as well as license it out to the appropriate entity when it comes time for that. So the point is that if through courses like this, you understand that your technology has value, you're still very much optimistic about its place in the market. It has commercial value and clinical potential to improve patient lives. There are resources that can be brought to bear. It can be a long road. The timeline depends upon the technology you're working on, and but there are resources to help you along the road to commercialization. Talk to us, talk to innovation partnerships, talk to the College of Engineering. We can help you move this thing along. So I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Meghan and John, who will talk about
Oh, it appears as if Brad's internet has frozen due to the ice storm that's going on right now. So he was just about ready to turn it over to you, Meghan. We'll see if we can get Brad to stop sharing. There we go.
Great. Brad's back. Okay,
I'm
yeah.
not sure where I dropped off there.
Yes, yeah, we got you.
Did I get to that last slide? And
Well, right before you were getting ready to transition to Meghan.
okay.
Froze.
All right, should I go ahead and get started?
Unless there were any questions, I was just going to say if there's any
Yeah.
questions before I turned it over, but are they able to ask questions directly, Catherine? Or do we have to use the chat function for that?
We're a small group. Feel free to do that if you would like to unmute yourself or raise your hand or
Yeah.
submit any way you'd like.
Okay, I guess not. Go ahead, Megan. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you. Oh, there's one chat that just came up. Is that question?
Q&A feature works
Okay.
well too.
All right, thanks. Okay, well, thank you, Brad, for that great introduction. Thanks to innovation, thanks to Fast Forward Medical Innovation for having me help participate in this, and thanks to the Department of Internal Medicine for this as well. I'm going to briefly go over MTRAC and Kickstart as funding opportunities that are accessible to you as PIs in internal medicine. Most broadly, MTRAC stands for Michigan Translational Research and Commercialization. It's a translational research funding mechanism sponsored by the Michigan Economic Development Corporation for the acceleration of transfer of IP from universities, nonprofit research centers, and hospital systems across the state. So it's a statewide program. There are 5 different hubs as a part of the MTRAC program that serve different areas of specialization of economic development in Michigan at different universities. And the Life Sciences Hub is one that is held or hosted at the University of Michigan. So specifically, the MTRAC for Life Sciences Hub supports translational research projects with high commercial potential and with the goal of impacting human health. So we target projects that are in a number of verticals, including therapeutics, devices, diagnostics, health IT, and research tools as well. And we're looking for projects that have the potential to eventually generate new intellectual property, raise follow-on funds, potential to license either directly to a bigger company, an existing company, or a startup, and create jobs. So there's 2 funding mechanisms under the MTRAC umbrella. Kickstart is an earlier stage funding mechanism. It is designed to enhance the commercial potential of a technology. So sort of earlier on in Brad's map of sort of research stages, as you're kind of exiting the basic research phase and entering the translational research phase. It's designed to fund a single milestone, a single de-risking milestone for that typically takes up to 6 to 12 months. Projects can be for budgets up to $42,500. And it's important to note there is a cost share requirement in that. So 50% of that budget is cost shared at the University of Michigan. These awards are given out twice a year, and I'll go over timelines later on in the presentation. And then MTRAC is a later stage translational research mechanism. It's designed for research with high commercial potential. We target technologies that in theory are 12 to 18 months from institutional exits that can be spinning out into a startup or licensing directly to an existing company. And then awards can be up to $250,000 in budget size, again, with a cost share requirement. And typically projects are designed to conclude in about a year. And this is offered once a year. So I won't go through all of these different categories or for appropriateness for Kickstart and MTRAC, but I wanted to put them up there. I think the basic gist of this is that for Kickstart, we're looking at more towards proof of concept stage and maybe some earlier in vivo efficacy or testing. And then MTRAC, a lot of that in vivo efficacy data should have been conducted, and you're working more towards iterative design, whether it's a device or health IT or expanding the experiments done around a therapeutic. But I basically recommend if you're interested in either of these mechanisms to contact me or contact the Kickstart program manager, John Dischinger. I'll give his contact information later. And then we can talk about what the appropriate stage your project is in. All right, so Kickstart, as I mentioned, is offered twice a year. Applications are due May 1st and November 1st. And there's an RFP open right now for May 1st. And then MTRAC is offered once a year. The RFP is typically released midsummer, and then your written applications are due early October. All projects receive feedback from an oversight committee on their written applications, and finalists are selected to present to the oversight committee. And from there, projects are selected in January. I mentioned projects that receive feedback from the oversight committee. So the projects are not selected by myself or anyone specifically internal to the U of M. There's a really strong external oversight committee comprised of experts with a lot of experience across industry, life science investment, and other areas of expertise. So throughout the application process, you're receiving a lot of really great feedback from experts and learning along the way. So that's a major benefit of participation is receiving that feedback from the oversight committee, whether or not you're funded. As well as you go through the application process, you will receive some mentorship from myself. If you're not already linked to a mentor in residence at Innovation Partnerships, we make sure that you are introduced to one. So these MIRs are experienced individuals with a lot of experience in industry or entrepreneurship, and can help you with your application process and guide you along the way as you think about commercializing your technology. If you aren't already participating in any of the educational opportunities Brad mentioned before, we will make sure to try and get you introduced to them as well as necessary. And then you have access to a broad network of people, both at Innovation Partnerships, FFMI, and then, as I mentioned, the Oversight Committee. So in the last 7 cycles of MTRAC, over $14 million of project funding has been awarded. A lot of the projects have been in therapeutics and device and diagnostic categories, but we also fund projects in digital health and research tools. And then the average budget is $215,000. So this should just give you an idea of sort of the average application. So just linking back to some of the metrics I talked about earlier, the MTRAC projects that have been funded have been really successful. So looking at some of the earlier projects that were funded between 2014 and 2016, over $5 million were awarded, and these have generated almost $100 million in follow-on funds. And then in more recent projects that I just mentioned, the last 7 cycles, over $14 million have been awarded, and so far these projects have already raised almost $70 million in follow-on funds. So participation in the program really does have a strong return, not only for the state of Michigan, but for the projects themselves and the universities that participate. So I'm going to go over 2 brief examples of projects. The projects are kind of have some similarities, but there's 2 separate take-home points I want to get to give to you from them. So this first project is specific to internal medicine, and Dr. Gurm is an interventional cardiologist. And I wanted to talk about this project specifically because I know a lot of clinicians often have ideas, or they have access to unmet medical needs and knowledge about that, but maybe don't have the expertise or the time to come up with a solution or to move the research along. So this project is an example of how Dr. Gurm, who's a co-inventor and co-PI on an MTRAC project, he partnered with Dr. Shi, who's a faculty member in mechanical engineering, and then a graduate student and postdoc, Robert Chestina, to design this medical device. It received a Kickstart award in 2018 and then an MTRAC award in 2019, and then was licensed to a new startup called AVS Pulse. So the kind of take-home point of this is that with Dr. Germ's heavy clinical appointment, he was still able to have a really successful project. And also wanted to point out that having Robert Chestnut be involved in the project, he took a really strong interest in becoming the business lead and making sure this project had followed through into a startup. I believe he's a CTO of the company now. And it's still going really strong. They recently announced $20 million Series B round, and then enrollment of their first patients in a clinical trial. And then the second story I wanted to present is not to present that you have to partner with Dr. Shia. That just happens to be a coincidence. But this project was not internal medicine; it was from neurosurgery. But they received an MTRAC award in 2019. And what I wanted to tell you about this project was that they spun out a company called Endovascular Engineering, which received Series A funding from a venture capital firm that has a partner that was on the MTRAC oversight committee. So having participated in MTRAC ended up being a really strong benefit to being able to fundraise later. So that kind of ties back to the take-home point that I was mentioning before, how the oversight committee is a benefit to the program. And so I'm going to stop there. I'm happy to take any questions. Here's my contact information and John's contact information for Kickstart. It's kind of a long URL down at the bottom, but you can find more information on the Innovation Partnerships website. And feel free to reach out to either myself or John at any point, and we can try and help you navigate when you might be ready for Kickstart or MTRAC funding.
Thank you, Megan. What questions does everybody have? Well, if you have one, feel free to submit or ask. Maybe at this time, Megan, we'll have you stop sharing. And then John, if you want to get ready to share your
I can't.
screen. Okay. Still no questions submitted, so go ahead, John, when you're ready.
Sure thing. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we can.
All right, cool. Well, thanks for putting on this session, John and FFMI team. So, yeah, let me dig in. So we're going to talk a little bit about venture capital. We're going to talk about the Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund, and then a little more broadly about how life science startups can create broad impact. So I'm going to touch on a lot of stuff, and we're not going to go very deep, but just to sort of whet your appetite in this space. So as John mentioned, I manage the Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund. This is a program that's run out of the medical school through Fast Forward Medical Innovation and the College of Engineering Center for Entrepreneurship. So we were in place to support and invest in emerging University of Michigan life science spinoffs. So as you know, the University of Michigan is in the business of research. We're not directly bringing new pharmaceuticals or medical devices to patient care. So then how do you take all this amazing research that's being churned out of the university and turn it into products that can improve the lives of millions of patients? And so one path to do this is through a startup company. So I'm going to give you a short overview of some topics in this space. Let me see if I can change. So a little background on my own career. I've focused on medical technology, product development, clinical testing, working on devices and software that can improve patient care. So been at the university a little over a year after spending time in both large companies like GE Healthcare here, working on diagnostic imaging, CT, molecular imaging, PET, and then also moving on to startup companies. So for example, a company that I was involved with in breast cancer screening. So taking a research prototype from a university lab, bringing it through product development, clinical trials, getting venture funding plus SBIR funding, and ultimately taking through a clinical trial and getting a FDA clearance. So I think, startups are one way. If you want to impact millions of patients with your work, that's one path, how you sort of scale that impact. So how do startups work? We're going to go into what is the impact of startups. We're going to talk about the fund. What are VCs looking for? What can impact your chances of success as a startup? And then some Michigan examples. So if we step back, venture capital is kind of the long-term fuel for a lot of our economy and a lot of the innovation within the life science space. There's a lot of familiar names that pop up that had their origins in venture capital, whether it's Moderna, Amgen, Genentech, Intuitive Surgical. These all have their origins, getting capital early. That's that high risk capital with the high potential for big impact. So if we look at that process of taking a prototype from a research lab to product, in this case, these pictures are related to Intuitive Surgical, which spun out of Stanford University. So stepping back, if you want to bring a product from prototype through FDA clearance, you're looking at around, $20-30 million, even for some of the lower risk sort of class 2 devices. If you go to higher risk, you're going to look at, approaching 100 million. And then for a drug to market, you're going to need 300 to even up to $2 billion. So that's why we're talking about venture capital, because ultimately you will very likely have to tap into that source of capital if you want to advance something from the lab to patient care. So in the case of Intuitive Surgical, like it spun out of Stanford, I think around 1995. And so they had to take on hundreds of millions of dollars in venture capital before they really saw significant traction. And we know that, now it's used in tens of millions of patient procedures, sort of revolutionized the field of surgery. But it took a lot of time and money to get there. So let's talk a little bit, within the context of the university. I through the other sessions in this seminar, talked a lot about the upstream path. So there's the invention, there's grant funding for research, there's translational programs like MTRAC that Meghan talked about, there's I-Corps. But what the university saw is that there's this gap where eventually these startups are formed. As Brad said, they're now a private entity outside the university, and they need to go out into the world and seek funding to move that forward. And often that's first funding can be in the form of an angel investor. And ideally it would be a venture investor that has the capacity to provide significant funding that can move it through that process that I mentioned earlier, that's going to require $20-30 million to get through FDA for a device. So they looked at this gap and said, what else can we do in this space? And that was really the impetus for the Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund, to work in this gap where you need capital, connections, and team to come together to move something forward. So if we look at the Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund, we would say we have a triple bottom line, which is we're taking equity investments in the companies. So we're looking for a return, but we're trying to build this venture ecosystem around the university. And we're looking at taking the research out of the university and bringing it to broad impact. As we mentioned earlier, the university is not in the business of making these products, so we need to have a handoff, either licensing it to a company or creating a startup to bring it forward to that impact. So where does the fund sit in this path? I know sometimes we look at this, there's like a valley of death with a bridge picture that sometimes comes up in these discussions. This is another way to view it. At the early startup stage, you have things like grants, you have the friends and family, angel investors that can provide a limited amount of capital. But ultimately here, within the life science space, you're typically going to have to tap into this venture capital market. And so the Biomedical Venture Fund sort of sits at the transition between these early angel investors, the grant funding, and then trying to bridge to a point where they meet milestones that will attract the larger checks and investments from venture capitalists. So it's a continuous process, and these lines are sort of blurry. We've seen situations at the university like actually that Meghan mentioned, where a venture investor got involved very early with a company called became endovascular engineering. And so sometimes the venture capitalists will go earlier for something that has more promise, but then they have to be more hands-on in that stage. So that's the sort of point where the fund is operating. And so we're a resource at the university to try to communicate with the venture capitalists. We have alumni on our board, VCs in Boston, Silicon Valley, and elsewhere that help provide input and feedback to these companies early, and can sort of figure out if they're on a path where if they meet the early milestones, can they attract that next investor. So the fund team is myself and an analyst, Kasha, and then you can see there's team members in both engineering and then in the med school represented by Brad with FFMI. So right now the fund itself has a portfolio of 13 companies. The companies we've invested in have raised over $140 million. Downstream, we've had one exit, which an exit in VC terms means a company was acquired or has an initial public offering. And so there's a variety of companies. Some of these have come out of the med school. Some of them have come out of internal medicine or have faculty members that are part of internal medicine. So I'll get into a couple examples a little bit later, but just wanted to show you the current status of the portfolio. And again, these are all the University of Michigan spinoffs based on research and discoveries that happened here. So the fund itself, we are the first step when a company comes to us and is seeking funding. It's a mini research project to dig into all aspects of the startup. And I'll get to a couple details on that in a moment. So when we ultimately decide to invest through our own analysis and input from our advisory board that represents external venture capitalists, then we're providing support to that team. We become an extended team member to help them work through problems. Sometimes we'll sit on their board, which means we're working shoulder to shoulder with them to try to address issues, try to help them find talent, try to help them find the right investor support. And then ultimately, when these startups succeeds, they return money to the fund, which is part of the university, and we can sort of rinse and repeat and cycle that through and build momentum and invest it in new startups. So what does a VC actually do? There's kind of three high-level buckets that they're involved in. One is fundraising. They need to raise capital themselves in order to deploy it to the startup. So they need to define what they say investment thesis, their focus area. Are they going to invest only in surgical devices? Are they going to invest in everything under the sun and just be a generalist? And then they need to convince what they call limited partners to give them money to deploy. And then there's the middle bucket, which is what we most often think of for an investor, which is they're looking for startups to invest in. They're performing what we call due diligence, or the research and analysis to determine if they think this is a good investment. And that's a multifaceted process. And they're really, it can be described as really the art of trying to make a decision with limited input. You'll never have complete information about the research and the holes in it. And you don't know everything you can about the team or the market because it's very dynamic. So it's really the art of making a decision with incomplete information. And ultimately they'll place an investment, and then that becomes part of the portfolio. So a typical venture capitalist will look, as a rule of thumb, look at 1,000 pitches, and then they may place an investment in about 1% of those. So you can think of it as a funnel, and at each step they sort of call that, and a certain segment of the startups will not make the cut, and then ultimately very few will make the deal. So in a way, they're kind of looking for that needle in a haystack where they think there's something really unique and compelling about the team and the market and the opportunity. And then after the company's in the portfolio, they will take on roles, as I mentioned, either on the board or in other capacities. They'll help the company with intros. They'll try to find other investors to form a network of investors that can continue to provide funding to the company. It's very rarely, or essentially never, when a single venture capitalist will entirely fund a company in one round or over the life of the company. So moving on. So one kind of nice, incomplete, but nice way to put it, what they're looking for is the jockey, the horse, the race. And so it's a nice way to say they're looking for the team or the leadership, which we can call the jockey. They're looking at the horse, which is the research or the product or the technology that's the fundamental idea behind the company. And then the race, which is the market. Are they playing in the big leagues, or are they playing, at a pony race in the county fair? And then the competition is obviously always at their heels, and it may be ahead of them, it may be behind them. So that's another aspect of this. But it's just sort of a helpful rubric that they're looking at all these aspects. It's not a pure scientific technical analysis. It's about the team It's about the market that they've chosen. So if we can sort of continue that analogy and look, if you have an idea that could play in the Kentucky Derby, you're looking at a large and growing market, a disease that maybe impacts on the order of tens or hundreds of millions of patients. Maybe in the therapeutic space, it's instead of a single indication, it's a platform that can be applied to multiple indications. It's a significant unmet need with potential for really differentiated results versus just an incremental improvement. So an example here might be if you had an autoimmune disease platform, then you'd be playing in a potentially very big market. Now, if you're in a smaller crowded market with limited applications, maybe it's an incremental improvement, it's better, but is it so much better that everyone's going to drop what they're doing and immediately switch to it when you bring it to market? For example, you might have a surgical device that has a really narrow indication for use and can only be applied in a limited situation with a small number of patients. This is not saying it's not worth pursuing and it's not worth funding, but it's probably not going to fit the venture capitalist model of what they're looking for in terms of a market size. So a little more insight into the mind of the VC. As I said, it's the art of making decisions with incomplete information. They're looking to reduce risk, and they're looking for those signals or proxies that indicate this is a good idea and the team is strong. So that can come in many forms, and there's not like a solid rubric, but that's team members that have had a successful track record in startups. And that isn't always the founder. It can be a team member that they add on, or a board member or advisor who's a big proponent and helps sort of provide that signal or proxy that this thing has potential. And then sector specific investors involved. Often we get early stage startups, they get an investment, but it's from a generalist investor that invests in everything from tech to consumer startups to med device. It doesn't provide a lot of signal often to the other investors of whether they've really vetted this thing. Certainly emerging from a strong lab and a PI with a strong reputation gets a lot of points. Also board members or advisors that have credibility, whether it's in the scientific, clinical, or business strategy case. I would say VCs run into pitfalls. There's certainly groupthink and confirmation bias, and you can leverage this to your benefit or it can work against you. I think sometimes venture capitalists can get lazy if they outsource their work and they sort of look to others to do their homework for them. You can lead to groupthink, and you can kind of think where that goes. That could be like Theranos or other situations where there wasn't deep diligence done by all those investors. They also they don't want to miss out on the next Facebook or large opportunity. So, but keep in mind, 90% of investments are expected to fail. So they'd like to make sure that that some of those have the potential to be a big win. And what can you do to increase those chances of success? So if you raise a round, it depends on the sector, but let's just say as a rule of thumb, it's going to be less than a 20 or 30% chance of your startup succeeding. And there's different definitions of success. Certainly getting the product into patient use, into clinical use is a great metric for success. There can be successes before that, for instance, in the therapeutic where a company might get acquired with early signs of success in trials, and then they may not ultimately make it to market. In a 510K, typically that acquisition in a medical device, typically that acquisition will happen after a 510K or even showing traction in product sales. So the odds are against you in a startup, but it's worth it because you can bring impactful research into products that can really move the needle for patients. So what can you do to improve the chances of success? So even before I really understood startups well, I thought it was a pretty straight line of breakthrough research. Everybody's like, ooh, we discovered this. It's a singular breakthrough, and it's inevitable that it's going to reach a product. I think nothing is further from the truth. There's so many hurdles and walls and problems that pop up, and a lot of them can't be foreseen. So that's why there's also a lot of weight put on the team. Is this team so driven to bring this vision into reality that they will knock down, turn corners, and navigate through these complexities, whether it's an unforeseen technical issue, the needed to find a new indication, which we've seen that directly happen. Maybe there's a competitor that enters the market and blindsides them. So that team needs to be resilient to address those problems they run into. And I'll briefly talk about, why do startups fail? And there's so many reasons, and they're all interrelated. but the market need is near the top. And that's why the commercialization education that the team here at FFMI through innovation partnerships provides is so critical, because often we have teams that think they really deeply understand the customer need in the market. And if they don't just really dig in deep there and understand it, they'll get blindsided and realize they've created a product that maybe there isn't quite as much demand as they thought. And investors are, and if there isn't that demand, the investors are going to realize it too. And you're going to have trouble with number two, which is you're running out of cash and you can't attract the investors because the problem isn't clear enough, or the market need is not significant enough. I think we've already touched on most of these, but it's this multifaceted problem. It's not just about the intellectual property or the promising tech, but it's this multifaceted problem. So you need a multidisciplinary team to execute on this. And that's often in the med bio space. It's having a business lead, experienced entrepreneur, and ideally they have some sector specific expertise where they can navigate the complex network of who's the customer, who's the payer, and then obviously the technical scientific founder that can be involved in varying degrees. Meghan mentioned the example, an internal medicine faculty member. They may stay on as an advisor, they may stay on as a CMO or CTO. And so there's all sorts of ranges of involvement, but most of the time it's bringing in an outside lead to pursue this full time. And then, so continuing on. So kind of in summary of that aspect, you're going to need to bring a lot of people with you to become a successful startup. The odds are kind of stacked against you, but it's worth pursuing. So the question is kind of like, if you want to go it alone, you will probably end up with 100% of nothing, or you bring others to the table, which includes co-founders to round out your skill set, which includes investors that can help both bring capital, talent, and open up other options. So a few Michigan startup success stories just to round out the last couple minutes. So Evoke Therapeutics is a story that recently had some signs of success. It started as a tech for cancer treatments. It's a breakthrough nanodisc technology platform. And then ultimately they pivoted to autoimmune disease because they saw a big market need. And part of that was the feedback from the investors they were going to have to convince to get involved. And so this was an MTRAC project, or MTRAC funded. And so the seed investment was done by the Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund, brought in other investors early. One of our board members ultimately joined as an advisor. So all those pieces of the puzzle of creating a team that has the scientific expertise, the clinical expertise, the business lead here, in this case, Bill Brinkerhoff, to really pull it all together and address and pivot around challenges. And recently they had a partnership with Gilead for about $660 million. So showing great potential for clinical impact. If we can whip through a couple other stories. So Genomenon, which I believe Meghan also mentioned, another Michigan spinoff, recently doing significant fundraising in the genomic health space. And ONL Therapeutics, which is a treatment for retinal disease, is into clinical trials and had a large fundraise last year. MDI Therapeutics, Dan Lawrence, faculty in internal medicine, has a early stage therapeutics company that just raised money last year to pursue treatments for fibrosis. Again, this is one of the companies we're involved with early. It's a sensor for continuous monitoring of drug and alcohol in sweat, and they were able to raise $1.5 million to move forward and taking, an early stage prototype. That was all they had at the time of their first investment into a product. And so they're on their way. Invenio Imaging, another spinoff out of the university, taking a product for rapid histology. We'll be pursuing FDA clearance later this year. So a lot of exciting work, and the impact can be very broad through startups. So is your project a fit? We've talked about these aspects that the venture capitalists are going to look for. Few just suggestions: seek that early input from friendly VCs. That includes the Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund. We're here to be a resource and provide feedback, even if it's really early. We're okay with meeting with the team and giving some feedback. Bring a multidisciplinary team forward. You're going to need to execute with this with a sense of urgency. It's not a side project. It's a full-time. It's more than a full-time gig to be a startup CEO. But as I mentioned, often we see faculty members take on these founding roles, but end up being advisors or other aspects. So you can have a successful company without VCs. So, I'm sort of painting this picture with VC centric view, but you're going to need a lot of capital. So these non-traditional or alternatives to traditional VC could come through grants. If you have a product that could conceivably get to market without as much funding, there's nonprofits and foundations that are often disease specific that can advance new treatments. So I hope this was helpful. Just a rapid fire intro to the world of VC and the role that the Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund can play. So I'm happy to answer questions now.
Or questions for any of our speakers?
Yes, excellent overview, John and Megan, both. Thank you. There was one question submitted. I see, Brad, you answered it around new indications for current technologies that are already licensed. Did you want to add any more to that?
Yeah, Abhishek asked a question about they believe they have a new indication for an existing technology. The first course of action is going to be to talk to somebody from Innovation Partnerships. The question is going to be, does the current patent cover what you're doing? Oftentimes, even if the current company does not pursue that indication, they may have a patent claim that talks about a broader application. So you need to look at the claims to be sure that you're not infringing upon them. If it really is a new indication that you're looking at, you could have something that's called a use patent that allows you to use an existing technology in a new indication. In either case, talk to your innovation partnership representative to find out what's out there and what the best path is for your new indication.
Thank you. And yeah, as you're thinking of any other questions, I'll note that in the chat feature, I sent a link to the upcoming FFMI fast-paced course, which was mentioned by all three speakers today. The next cohort starts on March 31st. Space is limited, so if you're thinking that you'd like to register for this program, which is free, by the way, please do so rather quickly, and then we will reach out to you to finalize some of those details. But it can be very helpful in formulating a preliminary business case for some of these funding mechanisms and whatever your next step resource may be.
As I mentioned during my presentation, these educational programs like the one that John just mentioned are often the way that people first dip their toe in the water here. You don't have to have a fully fleshed out business plan or even a clear idea of what this may be to take the program and get some value out of it. So if you think you want to maybe pursue this technology development process, I would strongly recommend a fast-paced course or any of these educational programs. Right.
And that program in particular has had projects that are very early stage, perhaps more appropriate for the Kickstart fund that Megan had mentioned, as well as those little later stage aligned with the MTRAC fund. And then I'll note that several of John's projects or companies rather in his portfolio are graduates of the course.
I think you've got some numbers, John, but those that have taken an educational course like that are much more likely to receive translational research funding. They have a much better, more complete application typically that identifies some of the general holes that can be encountered in the process of commercialization. You write better applications for sure.
Okay, it doesn't look like there are any additional questions. So I'd like to thank all three of our speakers again for joining us today. Fantastic presentations. Thank you for your time and expertise. I want to thank everyone that logged in and viewed the presentation today. I especially want to thank you if you were with us for all 6 of the webinars over the last several weeks. Thank you very much. If you have any questions or anything comes up and you'd like to reach out to anybody that was featured in a webinar, feel free to reach out to me or Catherine or to them directly. But we are here to help you in this innovation journey. So please feel free to reach out. And with that, we'll sign off. I wish everybody a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Everybody.